For as long as there's been human history, it feels like there's been war. It seems like this permanent, unavoidable part of who we are. But what if that's all wrong? Today, we're going to tear war apart, look right inside it, past the headlines, and into the actual machinery that makes it tick. And we're doing it with the help of an incredible report that brought together the thinking of 50 of the world's leading experts on this.
So let's just get right to it. The biggest question of all. Is this kind of massive conflict just baked into our DNA? Are we just stuck in this tragic cycle, doomed to repeat it forever and ever? It's a heavy question for sure, but the answer might not be what you think.
And here's the core argument of the report, and it is powerful. It says, the single biggest lie we tell ourselves about war is that it's inevitable. See, war isn't a force of nature, like a hurricane or an earthquake. It is a choice, a series of human decisions. And that's a game changer, right? Because if it's a choice, it means we can understand it. And if we can understand it, maybe, just maybe, we can choose differently.
Okay, so if it's a choice, let's dive into how that choice gets made. To do that, we have to start on the surface with the visible triggers. These are the reasons you always hear on the news, the big geopolitical chess moves that seem to kick everything off.
The report identifies 7 of these major catalysts. You've got your classic fights over resources and land. You've got that aggressive nationalism, that intense my country's the best kind of politics. Then there's a crisis in the balance of power, what some call the Thucydides trap, where a rising power starts to scare an established one. Of course, you have diplomacy failing. You have ideological crusades, a history of trauma that leads to a thirst for revenge, and finally, those technological arms races. Any one of these is dangerous, but when you start mixing them together, you've got a recipe for disaster.
And here's the key thing. These causes almost never act alone. They combine, and they react with each other to create this incredibly combustible mix. World War I is just the perfect tragic example of this. You had Britain and Germany competing for colonies, that's resources. You had explosive Serbian nationalism setting off a chain reaction. You had a rising Germany making the old European powers really nervous. And you had a massive naval arms race between the two biggest powers. Each one of these things fed the others until the whole continent was just a powder keg waiting for a single spark.
But knowing all those political and economic reasons, that really only gives us half the story. It explains why leaders might want to go to war, but it doesn't explain how they get millions of ordinary people to actually go and fight it. And that brings us to the next, much deeper layer of this whole thing, the psychology.
I mean, really, think about it for a second. What does it take to convince a normal person, a farmer, a teacher, a shopkeeper, to leave their life behind, pick up a rifle, and become willing to kill another human being they have absolutely no personal beef with? That's a huge leap, and that's exactly where the politics has to tap into our psychology.
So, for a political trigger like nationalism to actually work, it has to hook into something that's already wired into our brains. And it turns out, social psychologists like Henry Tajfel discovered our brains are basically hardwired to divide the world into us and them. We just naturally favor our in-group. And what political leaders do is they exploit this. They don't have to invent that impulse, it's already there. They just have to flip that switch and point it at an enemy.
Now this leads us down a path to one of the most disturbing, but also one of the most important insights about how war actually functions. We love to think that horrible atrocities are committed by monsters, by people who are just fundamentally evil and different from us. But the evidence, it suggests something way more chilling.
The philosopher Hannah Arendt, she came up with this term, the banality of evil. She was covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the chief organizers of the Holocaust. And she realized that evil on this massive scale, it isn't always driven by some monstrous, foaming-at-the-mouth hatred.
Sometimes it's the product of something far more, well, ordinary. It's thoughtless people just following orders, doing their jobs inside a massive bureaucratic machine.
And what was so terrifying about Eichmann, to Arendt, was precisely how normal he was. He wasn't a fanatic. He was a career guy, a bureaucrat who was just really good at logistics. The system he worked in had normalized atrocity. It turned mass murder into paperwork and train schedules. And when that happens, an individual's own moral compass can just get completely switched off.
And look, this isn't just one person's theory. Decades of research backed this up. You have Stanley Milgram's famous experiments, where he found that 2/3 of us, regular people, would inflict what we thought were painful electric shocks on a total stranger just because a guy in a lab coat told us to. Or Solomon Asch, who proved we'll literally ignore what our own eyes are telling us just to conform with what the rest of the group is saying. And then there's cognitive dissonance, this mental trick we use to justify doing horrible things by changing our beliefs, by telling ourselves, oh, the enemy isn't even really human anyway.
So, here's the crucial point, where it all comes together. War isn't just a political event, and it's not just a psychological one. It's a cascade. It's where political goals are pushed through by exploiting our own built-in psychological wiring. And understanding how that system works? Well, that's the first step to figuring out how to dismantle it.
So the report distills all this down into 5 huge lessons. 1. Wars are system failures, not just the fault of a single bad leader. 2. Psychology is the engine. Politics might be the spark, but our minds are the fuel. 3. Dehumanization is the absolute key. You simply cannot have mass violence without it. 4. Prevention is everything, because once a war gets going, it's almost impossible to stop. And finally, 5. There is actually hope. Recovery is incredibly hard, but it is possible.
Which brings us right back to where we started. War is a choice. But this final quote from the report adds this really sharp, cynical twist. It's a choice, all right? It's just a very, very expensive one, usually made by the people who were safely insulated from ever having to pay the real price.
And so that leaves us with one final, very personal question. Now that we've seen the blueprints, the political triggers, the psychological buttons, the systemic failures, we can't really claim we don't know how this works anymore. Knowing the anatomy of war forces us to confront our own part in it. The choice isn't just for leaders in some far-off capital city, it's for all of us. It's in how we think, how we talk, and what we demand from our world. So, knowing all this, what choice will we make?